Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you again, and it's my privilege to share once again and to try and bring you some encouragement in these strange days. We're now a few weeks into this whole new world, and here we are trying to work out what it is to be a follower of Jesus. I'm so delighted that I'm able to call myself a follower of Jesus, a son of the living God, loved, accepted. That's been a journey for me. And often I spend my time trying to understand the difference between my understanding of who God says I am and perhaps my own perspective on that at times, and trying to close that gap. And so I invest quite a bit of time in trying to really understand just how loved I am. And the great news is that that's the same for you. You are loved, accepted, and called by God, and He has a special place for you. In that journey for me, a big part of it has been learning about my strengths and weaknesses. And I've been investing in that. And one of the things that I've learned about myself in recent times is that I'm an optimist. Now, that's generally a good thing. But with being an optimist, there are some challenges as well. And one of those challenges for me is that sometimes, because I'm so optimistic about the future, I can miss the reality of what's going on around me. And so I have to do some reality checking from time to time. I don't know what life's like for you. Perhaps some of you are like me and you have a constant outlook that's positive and you're not too shaken by things. Maybe for others, you've got more of a balanced perspective and you can really see reality quite well. For others, you might really have a challenge with not being negative all the time. For some of you, it might be that your world really has been completely shaken in recent times and you're reeling and you're living in fear right now. And for others, it might just be that you've got your head buried in the sand and you're not really paying enough attention whatsoever. I don't know what it's like for you, but I do know that God has things to say to us. And I believe that today He wants to speak to us through 2 Corinthians chapters 3 and 4. And I'm going to particularly focus on a few verses in chapter 4. But before I do that, let me just tell you a little bit about some of the key things that Paul has to say in chapters 3 and 4 of 2 Corinthians, and encourage you to read those chapters later. Okay, so here's some things that Paul talks about. First of all, he tells a story really of his journey as a missionary throughout Asia. And he talks about the persecution and the rejection and the danger and the life-threatening situations he's been in. And in many ways, he has to put a defense up of his ministry. He also talks very openly about his weaknesses. Paul's not someone who's afraid to embrace reality. And he's very honest about his weaknesses, which is a really interesting thing. He also talks about how through the death and resurrection of Jesus, he, like you, is a minister of the Holy Spirit who dwells within him. And he talks quite a lot about the difference between law and spirit, the old covenant and new. And he talks about Moses. And he talks about how Moses would go up the mountain to meet with God, and he would come down and he would have to veil his face because the glory of God that was shining out from him was so powerful that it could potentially kill the Israelites all around him. And yet, says Paul, that glory that was based on the law is insignificant compared to the glory that now shines out from and through and actually in us as those who have the Spirit of God within us, that his glory that dwells within us is so much more powerful, which is a remarkable thought. And finally then, as he talks about the Spirit of God and his Holy Spirit, he makes it clear that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And that freedom from all the things that bind us, all the things that worry us, all the things that concern us, freedom is available to us through God today. And then we get to chapter 4, verses 7 to 12, and it says this, written by Paul, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you." Treasure in jars of clay, says Paul. And this is an analogy that would resonate with his listeners and his readers. People of the day would be very familiar with beautiful pots of clay that would be made and would be, because they're handmade, would be imperfect in so many ways, and yet they would be delicately designed and intricately made and really quite valuable and personalized. And these things would be put on a shelf, even though they were vulnerable, easily broken, easily damaged. Vulnerable things, they would be placed on a shelf of great importance. And then inside those things, those jars of clay, would be put family treasures, perhaps jewelry, heirlooms, key documents. So treasures were stored in these vulnerable jars of clay. And Paul was using this analogy to say to the people who were listening to him, look, guys, I am like one of those jars. I am an imperfect being. I'm broken. I have my weaknesses. I have my issues. I have my challenges. And yet the living God, the Holy Spirit, the giver of freedom, the glorious one, dwells within me as a treasure. And he doesn't just dwell within me, he does the same with you. And you too are like a jar of clay, but you have this treasure, the living God within you. And it's a wonderful, wonderful picture. His encouragement is to be aware of our weaknesses, aware of our brokenness, aware of the reality around us and what's truly going on, and yet filled with faith and confidence that the Spirit of the living God who sets us free dwells within us at the same time. Now, let me tell you a story. There's a well-known story about an admiral, or a general rather, called James Stockdale, who was the most decorated and most senior prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. And there's another author called Jim Collins, who wrote about Stockdale. He interviewed him and spent some time with him. He was fascinated by his story because Stockdale wrote a book about his experiences in this prisoner of war camp, where he had spent a number of years facing the most unimaginable horrors, facing situations that most of us wouldn't even be able to cope with the thought of. He was tortured over 20 times during that season. And in writing his book, and then Collins reading it, Collins described it as a depressing read because he said it was clear that Stockdale had no clear idea when, if ever, he would be free. And yet, somehow, he wrote with confidence. And Collins said that you could understand having some degree of confidence in your future if the end point was clear and you knew for certain it was going to come. But for Stockdale, that wasn't the case. And so Collins asked Stockdale, how did he cope with this situation? And Stockdale said to him very simply, he says, I never ever wavered in my faith that one day I would be free, I would escape from my captivity. And not only that, but I would make that the defining moment of my life and something that I would never change. Well, Collins was blown away by this and found it hard to even comprehend how Stockdale was able to do that. So he asked him some more questions. He said to him, so who was it in the camp that didn't survive in the way that you did? And Stockdale's response was unequivocal. He said, well, that's easy to answer. Those who didn't survive were the optimists. Well, that gets my attention as an optimist immediately. But Collins is confused. So he says, well, you sounded optimistic to me, so I don't understand. Help me understand. He says, let me be clear. I was not optimistic, although I never wavered in my confidence and my faith that I would be set free. So Collins pressed Stockdale further, and he wanted to really understand what the difference was between those who were the optimists that didn't make it and himself. So Stockdale said this. He said, well, the optimists were those who would look to the next event, Christmas, and they'd say, by Christmas, we'll be free. And Christmas would come, and Christmas would go, and they wouldn't be free. And so they looked to Easter and say, by Easter, we'll be free. And Easter would come, and Easter would go, and they wouldn't be free. And then they looked at Thanksgiving, and then to Christmas. And slowly their confidence would wane, and they died, says Stockdale, of a broken heart. And at this point, Stockdale grabs hold of Collins' shoulders, and he says this. This is what I learned. When you are facing great calamity, great difficulty, great danger, great uncertainty. You have to, on the one hand, never confuse the need for unwavering faith that you will find a way to prevail in the end, with, on the other hand, the discipline to confront the most brutal facts that you actually face. In their case, we won't be out by Christmas. And so the lesson is to hold in tension the absolute reality around us on the one hand, with a faith that we may have a glorious future on the other. It sounds a lot to me like Paul in this passage in 2 Corinthians. Treasure in jars of clay. Paul had no doubt about his weaknesses. He had no doubt about the reality around him, which was at times pretty bleak. And yet, as he absolutely confronted that brutal reality, he equally had a complete faith that the Spirit of the living God that gives him freedom would deliver him and give him a glorious future. In fact, his faith was so strong that he would encourage his readers at the end of this chapter 4, just like the writer to the Hebrews, to fix their eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. Let's just listen to some of Paul's words. He says this: "We were hard pressed on every side, but not crushed." It reminds me of a Star Wars scene with walls coming in on all sides and an inevitable crushing coming. And yet somehow, in the midst of that reality, a confidence that God would deliver him. And he did. Paul says he was perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. Jar of clay, and yet a treasure within. Confronting reality, but absolutely filled with faith and not blind optimism, by the way. And Paul is clear that he intentionally holds these things together in tension. So again, listen to more of his words, and let's just think about these jars of clay. He says, "We carry around in our body our jar of clay, the death of Jesus, our treasure, so that the life of Jesus, our treasure, may be revealed in our body, jar of clay. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal bodies. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you." It's almost as if Paul's saying, the more we embrace the brokenness that we have and that we live in and our imperfections, the more the glory of God shines through us. So what does this mean for us? There's just a few quick points to make. The first is this, that the centerpiece of this for Paul is actually about being a missionary. Paul was a man who needed to make an income. He needed a job. He had a job, in fact. He was a tent maker. He worked for a living. And yet, the only thing we hear Paul talking about here is the mission of God, his desire to be a representative of Jesus. That's the only thing he's talking about. That's his context. And the reason for that is this. He was clear that his identity was as someone who was living his life as a jar of clay in order to represent the treasure within. This is actually true of all of us. And I want to encourage us today, whatever your work might be, whatever you might use as terminology to describe yourself, in God's eyes, your primary call is to relate to him and to represent him. And today's an opportunity to start to reorder some of those perspectives. In these days of shaking, today is the opportunity to get a reality check on the perspective that you have on your life. The structures that hold you may be shaking, but the God who sustains you isn't. And if your confidence has really been in your income or your ability to do things, or in your family, or in your investments, or in your home, today's the day to try and think about actually confronting the reality of your weakness and your brokenness, or realigning your purpose, first and foremost, about being a representative of Jesus with a treasure within. And then he will be a deliverer of all the things that he's promised you. Just another thing to say, it's actually in our weakness and in our vulnerability that we become powerful agents of the gospel. When we embrace being jars of clay, that's when people can relate to us. Some kind of superhero mentality doesn't help us to relate to people. But when people can see that we are facing difficulty just like they are, then the treasure within, that's the difference maker between us and the rest of the world, really shines through. Optimism is good, but blind optimism is the problem, and it must be balanced with reality. Stockdale is clear that blind optimists don't make it. But Paul is saying, if you recognize your weaknesses, that you're a jar of clay, his strength, his treasure within you will allow you to thrive. And that's my lesson, to be optimistic, but not blindly optimistic, to root that in the treasure within. So I want to encourage you today to align your perspectives, to accept the reality that you face, and to focus your priorities on the treasure within. And for many of you, you may not yet be a follower of Jesus, but your world might be shaking. Things around you might be changing, and your opportunity is now. Your opportunity to explore what it is to have this freedom that comes from the Spirit of God that can dwell within you is available now. So why don't you just listen to the video at the end of this talk about a possible alpha course, or email us at hello@reachonline.org to find out more if you want to explore what it is to have a relationship with Jesus. For the rest of us, church, I just want to encourage us as we go forward. In these days, like never before, we have opportunities to be true representatives of Jesus, to make that our priority and let everything else flow from there. So let's be those that embrace our reality, but are absolutely confident in the treasure within. May God bless you. Have a great week, and I'll see you soon.